A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
I was looking through some old digital archives the other day, and I noticed something striking about how we use language to signal who we are. It feels like every few years, a single word comes along and just eats the entire cultural conversation. It becomes this massive gravity well of a term that everything else gets sucked into. It stops being a word and starts being a weather system.
I'm right there with you, Corn. Herman Poppleberry here, and I suspect you are talking about the word woke. It is probably the most contested four-letter word in the English language right now. It is a unique case because it has gone from a very specific, localized term to a global political shorthand in less than a decade. It has undergone a journey from a survival strategy to a slogan, and finally to a slur.
That is the core of it, and that is actually what we decided to dive into for today's episode. Usually, our housemate Daniel sends us a specific audio prompt, but this week, we actually sat down in the kitchen with Daniel and were just talking about how polarized everything feels. We realized we have never really done a deep dive into the actual linguistic and sociological roots of wokeism as a phenomenon. We wanted to take a step back from the shouting matches and look at how we got here. It is easy to yell about it, but it is much harder to explain what it actually is and why it changed so fast.
It is a solid pick for episode 982. If you look at the sheer volume of discourse around this, it is staggering. But if you ask 10 people to define what they mean when they use the word, you will get 12 different answers. It is what linguists call a floating signifier. It is a word that points to a vague set of ideas rather than a concrete object. It is a linguistic Rorschach test. What you see in the word says more about your political leanings than it does about the dictionary definition.
For our regular listeners, you might remember back in episode 845 when we talked about the weight of words and how different groups can speak the same language but hear completely different things. That is basically this topic on steroids. The word woke has become a shibboleth. Depending on how you use it, you are announcing your entire political identity to the room before you even finish your sentence. It is a way of saying, I am on this side of the line, and I assume you are too, or I assume you are the enemy.
You've got it. And to understand how it became such a powerful signal, we have to go back to the beginning. Most people think this started in 2014 or 2020, but the roots go much deeper into African American Vernacular English, or AAVE. The earliest recorded use of the concept, if not the exact phrasing, goes back to the 1930s. There is a famous recording by the blues musician Lead Belly from 1938 where he is talking about the Scottsboro Boys case in Alabama, where 9 black teenagers were falsely accused of a crime. At the end of the song, he literally tells people to stay woke.
And in that context, it was not a lifestyle choice or a political theory. It was a survival mechanism. It was a very literal warning to Black Americans to remain alert to the very real systemic dangers of the Jim Crow South. It meant being conscious of the underlying social and legal structures that were designed to work against you. If you were not woke, you were in physical danger. It was about awareness of the environment you were forced to navigate.
That distinction matters because it highlights that this wasn't just theory, it was about survival. Fast forward to the mid-20th century and you see it popping up in various black activist circles. In 1962, the novelist William Melvin Kelly wrote an article for the New York Times titled, "If You're Woke, You Dig It." He was writing about how white beatniks were appropriating black slang. It is incredibly meta when you think about it. Even back then, there was this tension about who gets to use these words and what happens when they move outside their original community.
So, what was the inflection point for our modern era? When did it jump the fence into the mainstream and become the monster it is today?
The big shift happened around 2014, specifically during the protests in Ferguson, Missouri, after the death of Michael Brown. That was the era of the rise of Black Twitter as a cultural force. The hashtag StayWoke started trending globally. It was being used to encourage people to look beneath the surface of news reports and understand the historical context of police-community relations. It was still largely tied to its original meaning of being alert to systemic injustice.
I remember that. But then something happened between 2014 and, say, 2017. It started getting used by people who were not part of that original community. It became a way for white progressives to signal that they were allies. It started appearing in mainstream media, in advertising, and eventually, the Oxford English Dictionary added it in 2017. That feels like the moment it lost its original anchor.
That is the moment of mainstreaming, and that is also where the trouble starts. When a word moves from a specific subculture into the mass market, it undergoes what linguists call semantic bleaching. The original, sharp, specific meaning gets washed out. It becomes a general synonym for being progressive or socially aware. It becomes a brand, and once it becomes a brand, it becomes a target. Because if you are someone who disagrees with those progressive policies, you now have a single catchy word that you can use to label everything you dislike about that movement.
Let's deconstruct that value set for a second. When people talk about wokeism today, especially from a critical perspective, what are they actually pointing at? Because it is not just one thing. It is a whole cluster of academic and social ideas.
You're hitting on the core pillars there. First, there is intersectionality, which is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It is the idea that different forms of discrimination, like racism, sexism, and classism, overlap and create unique experiences of marginalization. Then you have the rise of DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in corporations and universities. And finally, there is a general critique of traditional power structures and historical narratives.
It's striking because those are all very complex academic and sociological concepts. Intersectionality is a legal framework. DEI is a management strategy. But in the modern discourse, all of that nuance gets compressed into this one word. It is like taking a library of complex social theory and trying to squeeze it through a keyhole. And when you do that, you lose the nuance and you gain a lot of friction.
That's where the shift happens. By 2020, especially after the George Floyd protests and the subsequent corporate embrace of social justice rhetoric, the word woke started to be used almost exclusively as a weapon by the right. It became a way to frame social justice movements as a form of cultural Marxism or identity politics gone wrong. It shifted from being a description of awareness to a description of perceived overreach.
That's a point worth unpacking. If you look at the research, like that Pew Research study from March of 2023, it found a massive divide. About 56% of Americans actually said they saw the term woke as a positive, meaning to be informed and aware of social injustices. But 39% saw it as a negative, meaning being oversensitive or pushing a political agenda. The divide was almost perfectly aligned with political party lines. For a huge portion of the population, it is now just a synonym for annoying or performative activism.
It is the performative aspect that I think really fueled the backlash. When you have massive corporations changing their logos to rainbows for a month, or releasing statements about systemic injustice while simultaneously lobbying against labor laws or environmental regulations, it creates a sense of profound phoniness. Both the left and the right started to find it exhausting. The left saw it as a hollow substitute for real material change, and the right saw it as an invasive cultural imposition. But the right was much more successful at naming that exhaustion and turning the word woke into a catch-all for that feeling.
So, is it purely a pejorative now? Does anyone still use it positively in 2026?
It is becoming increasingly rare. You still see it in some grassroots activist circles, but even there it has been largely replaced by other terms like socially conscious, equity-focused, or simply being aware. The word has been so thoroughly colonized by its critics that using it positively now almost feels like you are walking into a trap. It is a bit like the term political correctness in the 1990s. It started as an internal joke among liberals, then it was adopted as a serious standard, and then it became a permanent insult used by the opposition.
It is a classic linguistic cycle. But what is different this time is the speed and the global reach. This is not just a United States phenomenon anymore, is it? I have seen headlines from all over the world using this exact terminology.
Not at all. And this is where it gets really compelling from a geopolitical perspective. We have seen the anti-woke rhetoric exported all over the world. In France, President Emmanuel Macron and various French intellectuals have actually warned against American woke culture. They see it as a threat to French universalism. The idea that all citizens are equal under the state regardless of race or religion, and their specific model of secularism, which they call laïcité.
That is notable because the French have their own very long history of revolutionary and progressive thought. They are not exactly known for being conservative in the American sense, but they see this specific brand of identity-focused politics as a foreign import that doesn't fit their culture. They see it as an Anglo-Saxon imposition of racial categories onto a society that tries to be colorblind in its legal structure.
They see it as a form of cultural imperialism. You see similar things in the United Kingdom, where the common sense group of members of parliament has explicitly campaigned against what they call the woke agenda in national institutions like the National Trust or the BBC. Debates over gender identity in schools and the removal of historical statues are framed using the exact same woke versus anti-woke language we use here. Even in Latin America, politicians like Javier Milei in Argentina have used the term to describe international NGOs or social movements they want to discredit. It has become a global brand for a certain type of modern progressivism.
And that global spread is fueled by the same thing that fuels everything else these days: algorithmic amplification. The term woke is high arousal. It triggers an immediate emotional response. If you put woke in a YouTube title or a social media post, the algorithm knows it is going to get engagement, whether that is people cheering or people watching. It is a click magnet.
That is the engine behind the semantic signaling we see. We talked about this a bit in episode 686 when we looked at the tech and politics of pronouns. The actual policy or the actual linguistic change is often less important to the platform than the conflict it generates. Woke is the perfect fuel for that fire because it is vague enough to apply to almost anything. It is a low information, high emotion signal.
Let's talk about that vagueness for a second, because it leads to a real problem in how we have conversations. If everything is woke, then nothing is. I have seen people use the term to describe everything from a multi-billion-dollar investment strategy, like ESG, to a cartoon character having a different skin color than they remember from their childhood. It is being used to describe both serious corporate governance and the casting of a mermaid.
The ESG example is a perfect case study for our discussion. For those who don't know, ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance Criteria. It is a framework that investors use to evaluate companies based on things like their carbon footprint, their labor practices, and their board diversity. Now, there are legitimate, deep technical critiques of ESG. You can argue about whether these metrics actually predict long-term financial value, or whether they are just a way for fund managers to charge higher fees for greenwash products. Those are substantive financial arguments.
But instead of having those financial arguments, a lot of the political pushback just labels ESG as woke capital. We saw this in Florida with the legislative pushback led by Governor Ron DeSantis against firms like BlackRock.
In 2023, Florida passed House Bill 3, which specifically prohibited state officials from investing public funds to promote ESG goals. The rhetoric surrounding the bill was all about fighting wokeism. And once you label it woke capital, you stop talking about the actual data or the governance structures, and you start talking about a culture war. It simplifies a complex economic debate into a tribal signal. It is much more effective for a political campaign to talk about fighting a woke mob than it is to talk about fiduciary duty and asset allocation.
It is the same thing we see in the United Kingdom regarding gender identity in schools. There are very sensitive, difficult conversations to be had there about safeguarding parental rights and the best way to support vulnerable children. These are issues that require a high degree of empathy and specific evidence-based policy, but those conversations often get flattened by the labels. One side calls the other bigots, and the other side calls the first side woke. And once those labels are out, the actual thinking usually stops. The label becomes a substitute for the argument.
That is the danger of the dismissive use of anti-woke rhetoric. It allows people to bypass the hard work of critique. A legitimate critique of a DEI program, for instance, would look at its specific outcomes. Does this training actually reduce bias in hiring? Does it improve employee retention? Is it a good use of the company's budget compared to, say, raising the base wage? Those are fair, necessary questions. But if you just say, this program is woke, you are not actually critiquing the program. You are just dismissing it based on its association with a label you dislike. You are signaling your tribe rather than engaging with the reality of the policy.
I think we need to be careful here, though, because there is also a performative side to the progressivism that deserves critique. When institutions adopt the language of social justice, but don't actually change their underlying behavior, that is a form of what some people call woke-washing. It is using the language of awareness as a shield against actual accountability. It is the corporate equivalent of thoughts and prayers.
I couldn't agree more. And that is why some of the most incisive critiques of woke culture actually come from the left. There are plenty of progressives who feel that the focus on linguistic purity and identity signaling is a distraction from material concerns like wages, healthcare, and housing. They worry that the culture war is a gift to the very power structures that the original Stay Woke movement was trying to dismantle. If we are arguing about the wording of a mission statement, we aren't arguing about why the CEO makes 400 times more than the average worker.
It reminds me of that old saying about how the elite want us fighting a culture war, so we don't start a class war. If we are arguing about the word woke, we aren't arguing about why the cost of living in Jerusalem or New York or London has tripled in the last 20 years. We are fighting over the labels on the box while the box itself is on fire.
Spot on. And that brings us to a really important point about how we, as listeners and citizens, can navigate this. If we want to have better discussions, we have to move past the labels. We have to apply what I like to call the precision principle.
I like the sound of that. Tell me more about how that works in practice.
It is pretty simple but very difficult to do in the heat of an argument. The precision principle says that whenever you feel the urge to use the word woke, whether you are using it to praise something or to attack it, you should try to replace that word with a specific descriptor of what you are actually talking about. You have to force yourself to be granular.
So instead of saying that movie was too woke, you would have to say, I felt like the dialogue in that movie was sacrificing character development to make a political point that felt forced and didn't fit the story.
For instance, or instead of saying, we need to be more woke as a company, you would say, we need to look at our hiring data and see why we are not attracting a broader range of candidates from different backgrounds, and then change our outreach strategy. When you use specific language, you are making a claim that can be debated, tested, and refined. You are giving the other person something to actually engage with. When you use the word woke, you are just throwing a grenade. You are ending the conversation before it begins.
That's the idea. It also helps you identify when the person you are talking to is actually interested in a conversation. If you ask someone, what specific policy or behavior are you referring to when you say, this is woke? And they can't give you an answer, then you know you are not in a substantive debate. You are just in a semantic signaling match. You are participating in a ritual, not a discussion.
That is a great practical tip, Korn. Asking for specifics is the ultimate kryptonite for performative rhetoric on both sides. It forces people to move from the abstract, high-arousal realm of the culture war back down to the concrete reality of what is actually happening. It turns down the temperature and turns up the resolution.
We touched on this in episode 876 when we discussed the global battle over free speech. A lot of the attempts to ban woke content in schools or libraries are based on very vague definitions. When the law is vague, it creates a chilling effect because nobody knows exactly where the line is. If you can't define woke in a legal statute, how can you legislate against it without catching everything else in the net?
You can't, at least not fairly. And that is why we see these laws being challenged in court. The legal system, for all its flaws, generally requires the kind of precision we are talking about. You can't just sue someone for being woke. You have to prove they violated a specific statute, a contract, or a constitutional right. The court doesn't care about your vibes, it cares about the text.
I wonder, Herman, do you think the term woke will eventually go the way of political correctness? Is it just a historical relic of the early 2020s that we will look back on and find a bit embarrassing? Like, will we be explaining this to our grandkids in 20 years as this weird fever dream we all had?
I think it is already headed that way. Language moves so fast now because of the internet. Words get used up. They get oversaturated until they lose all their potency. We are already seeing new terms start to bubble up to describe these same tensions. But the underlying issues, the questions of identity, power, and how we live together in a diverse society, those aren't going anywhere. We will just find new words to fight about them. The word might die, but the conflict is perennial.
It is the cycle of semantic drift. We covered that a bit in episode 743 as well, specifically looking at how the lines between political criticism and deeper prejudices can get blurred when the language we use is not precise. When we use broad labels, we give cover to people who have much more extreme views.
It is all connected. Whether we are talking about geopolitics here in the Middle East or corporate culture in Silicon Valley, the quality of our discourse depends on our ability to resist the easy label. The label is the enemy of the thought.
I think that is a really powerful takeaway. It is easy to be lazy with our language, especially when we are angry or feel like our values are under attack. But that laziness is exactly what the algorithms want. It is what keeps us clicking and keeps us divided. It is the fuel for the outrage machine.
And it is what prevents us from finding actual solutions. If you are a conservative who is genuinely worried about the influence of certain ideologies in schools, you are much more likely to be successful if you engage with the specific curriculum and the specific pedagogical theories than if you just shout about woke teachers. And if you are a progressive who wants to see real change, you are much more likely to get people on board if you talk about the tangible benefits of your policies rather than just demanding that everyone stay woke. Substance wins in the long run, even if signaling wins in the short term.
It is about moving from signaling to substance, and I think that is a good place to start wrapping this up. We have covered a lot of ground today, from Lead Belly in 1938 to the legislative halls of Florida and the intellectual salons of Paris in 2026.
It really is a fascinating journey. It shows how a single word can act as a mirror for all of our deepest cultural anxieties. It starts as a cry for awareness and ends up as a tool for division. It is a reminder that language is never just a tool for communication. It is a tool for power.
So, for our listeners, here is the challenge for the week. The next time you see the word woke in a headline, or you hear someone use it in a conversation, just pause for a second. Try to apply that precision principle. Ask yourself, what is the actual thing being discussed here? Is it a policy? Is it a piece of art? Is it a behavioral norm? And then, if you are feeling brave, ask the person using the word to do the same. Ask them, what do you mean by that specifically?
It is a small thing, but it is how we start to reclaim our discourse from the machines and the tribalists. It is how we start talking to each other again instead of just at each other.
Well said, Herman. And hey, if you have been enjoying these deep dives, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and helps us keep this collaboration going. We are a small team, and your support is what keeps the lights on.
It really does make a difference. We are coming up on episode 1000 soon, which is a bit mind-blowing when you think about it. We have been doing this for a long time, and we are still finding new weird prompts to explore.
You can find all of those past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today about the weight of words and the politics of pronouns, at myweirdprompts.com. There is a search bar there, so you can look up any topic we have covered over the last few years.
And if you want to get in touch, there is a contact form on the website as well. We love hearing from you even if you disagree with our take on things, especially if you disagree. That is what the whole show is about, after all, exploring these weird prompts and ideas together from different angles.
We are a team, and we want you to be part of that team of exploration. Thanks to Daniel for being the catalyst for this conversation today. It was good to get some of that kitchen table energy into the studio. It reminds us that these aren't just abstract academic topics. They are things we are all trying to figure out in our daily lives.
Definitely. All right, I think that is it for us today.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corin Poppleberry.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you in the next one.
Stay curious, everyone.
And maybe just a little bit woke, in the original sense of the word. Stay alert to the world around you.
Fair point. Until next time.
See ya.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our gonna show my weird prompts where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth